In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you my Bloodhound build, which is an all-game build that can be used at the beginning of the game, as well as into New Game Plus and throughout. And I'm going to be showcasing how you can play this build with one single Bloodhound's Fang, or if you want to dual wield them. So let's talk a little bit about the Bloodhound's Fang first, since this is the weapon we're using for this build. One great thing about this is it can be found very early in the game in the Limgrave area by defeating the Bloodhound itself. So you can get this pretty much from the beginning of the game if you just beeline it there and defeat him. Then you'll be able to use this weapon all through your first playthrough, and then if you want to use it again in New Game Plus, you can. A few things stand out about this weapon, notably the attack rating is very, very good for its weight and for how early in the game you can get it. It has phenomenal scaling, and it'll scale very well throughout your first playthrough and very well throughout New Game Plus, making this a weapon you can probably play at least 3 playthroughs with just by itself. Secondly, it has native bleed buildup on it, which most curved greatswords don't have, and one thing that's also great is that you can actually buff this weapon as well. So not only do you get bleeding, but then you can buff it with like blood grease to give it even more bleeding, or you can buff it with something like fire in order to give it extra damage, or lightning, or whatever. So not only do you get that bleed buildup, but then you can buff it even further. Not many weapons can do that in this game. This one can. And the weapon has a unique property that it deals increased jump attack damage. So if you're playing this with a single weapon, or if you're using dual wield, you're going to get increased jump attack damage when you're using this, making it perfect for a jump attack style of play. And lastly, Bloodhound's Finesse is a unique weapon skill that allows you to slash and then sort of dart away. And then if you follow up with an R2, you can actually dart in and attack again. And it has a little bit of iframes on both of these animations, depending on exactly where you are in them, allowing you to kind of maneuver in and out of combat if you time your attacks correctly and not get hit by bosses. So generally when I'm playing with this weapon, there are 2 ways that I like to lead off like a boss fight. I will either run in and jump attack, follow that up with an L2 to sort of dart away, avoiding attack, and then dart in with an R2, or I'll run in and use an L2 instantly. If I know the boss is going to attack me more quickly, that'll get me away faster, and then I'll be able to follow up with an R2. Just depends on which boss you're facing, and it takes a while to learn. I'm not sure I have this down completely myself, because I have not learned all the boss moves in this game with this weapon, trying to use this weapon skill. But you'll just have to practice at it and get a read on enemies and bosses and figure out what you can do. But that L2 is really good at attacking quickly and getting you out at the same time, and then you can follow up with an R2. When you're darting in with that R2 and you have iframes through that part, so ideally you're going to be darting through the enemy attack that misses you because of the iframes, and then you connect for damage. So the style for the jump attack doesn't really matter much. If you're using one weapon or 2 weapons, it's going to be the same strategy. You can go in and jump attack with L1, follow up with an L2, follow up with an R2, or sometimes you can just follow up with extra jump attacks. It depends on the enemies that you're facing. But if you're playing with 2 weapons, the style play isn't that drastically different. You might just prioritize jump attacks a little more often with regular enemies and easier to kill enemies. So when it comes to armor for this build, one main piece is the Raptor's Black Feathers. This further increases your jump attack damage, which is going to stack with your Bloodhound's Fang, so that your jump attacks deal increased damage. The downside is this armor doesn't have a lot of protection or poise, so you want to make up for that with the other pieces that you're using. I'm using the Bloodhound set here. You can definitely have a much stronger set than this. I was sort of cosplaying as a Bloodhound with this build, so if you want to do that, you can use those pieces. But wearing heavier armor for those pieces is more ideal. It's going to give you poise by itself, and it will also give you more protection. When it comes to talismans I'm using for this build, I have Shard of Alexander to increase the damage that we do with Bloodhound's Finesse. I have the Claw Talisman to give us even more jump attack boost. Between the Bloodhound Fang itself, Raptor's Black Feathers, and this, you're getting 3 things that boost your jump attack damage, so you definitely want to use jump attacks with this build. Beyond that, I have the Dragon Crest Great Shield to help reduce the damage we take, and I'm using the Bull Goat's Talisman because of the way I'm set up to make sure I have enough poise. But if you're using heavier armor here, I recommend using something like the Green Turtle Talisman to get more stamina recovery. You use a lot of stamina with this build. Getting that stamina recovery is nice to have. You can also use like the Green Turtle Shield in order to give yourself more stamina recovery if you're just playing on your first playthrough and you only have one of these anyway, and wear it on your back to get even more stamina recovery. And as I mentioned, you can buff this weapon with greases depending on what you're facing. For instance, if you're facing an enemy that's weak to bleed, using the blood grease will help stack with your bleeding, make you set bleeding more likely on the target, depending on whether you're on New Game Plus or New Game. If you're on New Game, this will make it easier to set bleeding because your damage won't be as high, but I find in New Game Plus you tend to kill things faster than the bleed will trigger most of the time. But in New Game, this will be much more effective for you. You can use something like Fire Grease as well. This works really well against like Crucible Knight, for instance, who can't be bled, but is kind of weak to fire, so you can get extra damage that way. And just depending on what the enemy and boss weakness is, you can buff with this. I don't buff with it regularly when I'm just attacking regular enemies, but if you need a little extra damage, this is a good way to do it. And if you're playing a New Game Plus, you should have all the recipes for these, and if you're a new game, you should be able to do the bleeding and fire ones rather early on in the game anyway. When it comes to attributes we have for this build, we have 50 Vigor, 21 Mind, 25 Endurance, 40 Strength, 70 Dexterity, 16 Intelligence, 7 Faith, and 9 Arcane. You don't need any Intelligence, Faith, or Arcane for this build. Disregard those because of the starting class. We have 50 Vigor in order to give us enough health to trade hits. You do trade hits with this build quite regularly. You're going to take this up to 60 throughout New Game Plus to get even more health. When it comes to mine, I got 21 here. This should definitely be higher if you're going into New Game Plus. You'll probably want to put this at 25 or 30. Bloodhound's Finesse does consume quite a bit of FP because you have initial FP costs on the first L2 and then more on that follow-up R2. So you will use about 20 for that whole combo. 21 Mind is probably enough to do that like 5 or 6 times before you need to chug a flask, which is not much. You're not using this much on regular enemies though, so you don't need a high mind count. It's not something I would prioritize, but eventually you'll probably want to take that up to at least 25 or 30 just to make your life a little bit easier. I have 25 Endurance here. This is enough to wear the armor set I'm wearing, plus 2 Bloodhound Fangs. But if you are wearing heavier armor to get more protection, which is kind of the min-max setup I recommend, you'll probably want to take Endurance up to like 30 or 35, depending on the armor sets that you're using, in order to be able to medium roll still. Strength is at 40 and Dexterity is at 70 here, giving us quite a bit of damage for this build. You'll probably want to take Dexterity up to 80 and then Strength up to 80 after that to get the most out of this weapon. If you're two-handing it, Strength's gonna, give you a little extra damage when you're two-handing it, but once you're dual-wielding, that bonus is gonna go away. So keep that in mind, but Dexterity does outperform Strength for a good ways of the scaling, so I recommend just going all the way up to, 80 Dexterity after you get to 40 Strength, and then going from 40 Strength to 80 Strength. Now, even though you don't need any Faith or Arcane for this build, theoretically you could add some in order to use something like Flame Grant Me Strength or Golden Vow at some point. I recommend maybe doing that in New Game Plus if you're still playing this build and you're trying to find ways to gain more damage. That would be a good way to increase your damage. But one thing I really like about this build is it's pretty much buff free, other than Grease, which you can use during boss fights if you want or not. It's not necessarily mandatory. You're not buffing yourself constantly outside of combat, so you don't really have to worry about constantly buffing to get damage. You have very high damage with this build as it is, and it's good on horseback, it's good in a variety of situations, so you don't really need to do that. So a couple of tips before I wrap up this video. First, I don't have Lord of Blood's Exaltation or White Mask in this build because I find that I just don't trigger blood loss enough in order to get that attack power boost. I'm playing in New Game Plus, so I outright kill things before they die from bleeding. However, if you're playing your first playthrough, these would probably be a lot more applicable to you. You don't get Lord of Blood's Exaltation until much further in the game, unless you know what you're doing. That's the same case with White Mask. There is a way to get it sooner, but these aren't really going to play a huge role in this build, even if you're using the Blood Grease, just because you don't trigger bleeding that much, particularly in New Game Plus. This is less true in New Game, except, again, you don't get these things until much later in the game, so by the time you get them, you don't have a lot left in your New Game playthrough. Second, if you're looking to use a Great Rune for this build, I highly recommend Godric's Great Rune. You need Vigor, you need Mind, you need Endurance, you need Strength, you need Dexterity, and if you do want to take a little bit of Faith in order to use like Flame Grant Me Strength for boss fights, that would be good too. So that's 6 out of the 8 stats, which is fairly good. Another good choice here would be Radahn's, which gives you FP, Stamina, and HP. All those are very useful for this build as well. And lastly, when it comes to your Flask of Wonders physique, you're going to want to use the Green Burst Crystal tier to increase your stamina recovery. You use a ton of stamina with this build, particularly when you're using Bloodhound's Finesse, so you want that to come back quickly in order to be able to use this over and over. And when it comes to damage, the best one I could suggest is the Dexterity tier in order to just increase your damage outright, unless you have 80 Dexterity already, in which case I would put Strength in there to get more scaling out of Strength. There isn't one that really affects, like in terms of attacking rapidly to gain attack power. That Crystal tier doesn't really help in this build, nor does the charged attack, because you don't tend to use those either. So this is really a good way to get some damage at least. So that wraps up our Bloodhound build video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I know people have been asking for this one for a while. We do have more builds coming. I still have a lot of ideas, and I am currently working on the Colossal Swords weapon video. So for those of you interested in those videos, that one should be coming out probably not this week because I'm gone for a few days, but it'll probably come out at the beginning of next week. Again, let me know what builds you guys want to see and what weapons you guys want to see after that one. I'm always taking these into consideration when I'm prioritizing builds. So if you have ones you want to see, let me know in the comments below.